We were about to leave for a family party. My son pulled up the new car to my door, and through the window, I could see his in-laws sitting comfortably. Without even getting out, he rolled down the window and said, "Mom, take an Uber. There's no space in the new car." The humiliation of being treated like a nuisance in front of his family was the last straw. Calmly, I said I wouldn't go to the party anymore. Instead, I went inside and made a single call to the bank. I canceled the car loan that, obviously, was in my name. It didn't take long. The next day, he called me, completely desperate. My name is Helen, and at 67, I've learned that a mother's heart is made of the toughest cloth. It can be stretched, patched, and frayed at the edges, but it rarely tears completely. I've spent 40 of those years hunched over a sewing machine, the constant hum of its motor, the soundtrack to my life. My fingers, now gnarled and marked by countless needle pricks, have crafted wedding dresses, tailored suits for job interviews, and mended the knees of my only son Richard's jeans. Every stitch was a small prayer, a silent wish that his future would be brighter and softer than the coarse fabrics that so often passed through my hands. I always believed that sacrifice was the purest form of love, a belief that guided my every decision, especially when it came to him. Richard was my son, and I, like an aging sunflower, continued to turn my face toward him, seeking the warmth of his approval even as I felt my own leaves wither. That Saturday morning, the spring sun streamed through my living room window, painting golden stripes across my worn carpet. It was my nephew's wedding day, an event I awaited with an almost childish excitement. There was a special reason for my joy. It would be the first time I'd go out in public with Richard in his new car, a gleaming black imported SUV that seemed too large for the narrow, tree-lined streets of our neighborhood. A car whose loan payment book, with installments that devoured nearly half of my Social Security check, was held by a magnet to my refrigerator door. Every time I opened the fridge for a carton of yogurt, I saw that reminder of my investment. It wasn't an investment in steel and tires, I told myself, but in my son's happiness and social standing. He needed that car to impress his in-laws, Lawrence and Beatrice, a couple who measured a man's worth by the brand on his watch and the roar of his engine, and I, in my blind loyalty, had co-signed the papers without blinking. I spent the morning getting ready with a care I hadn't devoted to myself in a long time. I wore a navy blue dress, a simple fabric, but with an elegant cut I had tailored myself. I'd spent more than I could afford on it, but the image of arriving at my son's side, proud, was worth every penny. I dabbed my neck with a bit of the French perfume I saved for occasions that never seemed to come. I looked in the mirror and saw a tired woman with wrinkles that told stories of worry and hard work. But in that moment, I also saw a spark of hope in her eyes, the hope that this day would mark a turning point, a moment when I wouldn't just be the silent provider, but a visible, celebrated part of his new life. With a fluttering heart, I left my house and walked the 2 blocks to his, feeling the sun warm my face and the gentle breeze lift the hem of my new dress. As I turned the corner, the sight that greeted me froze my feet to the sidewalk. The SUV was idling in front of the driveway, its doors open. In the back seat, Lawrence and Beatrice were already comfortably settled. She, in a stylish hat and sunglasses that looked like they were worth more than all my kitchen pots combined. He, adjusting his silk tie while saying something that made her laugh, a crisp, distant sound that didn't reach me. They looked like they belonged in that scene of luxury that my sweat was helping to build. Richard came out of the house, impeccable in his suit. He saw me standing there, and his smile faltered. His eyes slid away from mine, fixing on some indefinite point down the street. His wife, Vanessa, appeared right behind him, her beautiful face an impassive porcelain mask. The silence that fell was heavy, loaded with everything unsaid. I took a step forward, my hopeful smile now feeling like a flimsy patch on my face. It was then that Richard, finally looking in my direction, but without really seeing me, broke the silence with words that would echo in my soul for a long time. "Mom, sorry, but there's no room. Just grab an Uber. We'll meet you there." His words hung in the air for a moment, suspended in the bluish smoke curling from the exhaust pipe, before they pierced my chest like shards of glass. For a second, my brain refused to process the scene. The car, my car, leaving. His in-laws, Lawrence and Beatrice, staring straight ahead, indifferent, as if I were just a lamppost on the sidewalk. Richard didn't look back. The door closed with a dry click and the SUV pulled away, its engine growling with a power that seemed to mock my fragility. I stood there, motionless, in my new dress and expensive perfume, feeling the curious stares of neighbors like needles on my skin. The woman from the 2-story house across the street, who always greeted me with a smile, now had her face pressed to the window, a nosy shadow behind her lace curtains. I felt a flush of heat rise to my face, a wave of humiliation so intense it left me breathless. My first reaction was denial. He must have been joking. Maybe he'd turn around at the corner, laughing, to pick me up. But the car disappeared at the end of the street, taking with it the last spark of my hope. The walk back home was the longest of my life. Each step seemed to demand a Herculean effort. The shoes, which had felt elegant before, now pinched my feet mercilessly, reminding me of the futility of my effort. The navy blue dress, which I had chosen with such care, suddenly felt like a ridiculous costume, an outfit for a party I'd been kicked out of before it even began. I opened the door to my house and the silence swallowed me. It was a different, accusatory silence. The small, wrapped gift for the newlyweds sat on the coffee table, a bright, cheerful reminder of the celebration I wouldn't see. My eyes were drawn, like a magnet, to the refrigerator door. There it was, the loan payment book. Those sheets of paper, with their numbers and due dates, seemed to stare back at me. Each payment represented a small death, the supplemental health insurance I'd canceled, the fresh fruit I stopped buying, the leaky faucet in the bathroom I kept putting off fixing. I had sacrificed my comfort and my security for that car, the car that had no room for me. The doorbell rang, a shrill sound that cut through the stillness and made me jump. I thought about not answering. I wanted to curl up on the sofa and disappear, but the ringing persisted. Dragging myself to the door, I looked through the peephole and saw the familiar face of Marlene, my neighbor and friend for over 30 years. I opened the door, and her smile vanished the moment she saw my face. "Helen, what happened? Weren't you going to the wedding?" Her words, filled with genuine concern, broke the dam I had built around my heart. The tears I'd been holding back came with an overwhelming force. Marlene hugged me, asking no more questions, and guided me to the sofa. Between sobs, I told her what had happened. She listened in silence, her dark eyes flashing with an indignation that I, buried under my pain, couldn't yet feel. "That boy was never like this, Helen," she said, her voice low and firm. "After he got together with that girl, with that family, he changed. They're getting in his head." Her words planted a seed of anger in the field of my sorrow. Marlene stayed with me for another hour, made a chamomile tea that I barely touched, and then left, promising to check on me later. I was alone again, but something had shifted. The sadness was still there, but now it was accompanied by a cold, quiet fury. I picked up my old tablet, a birthday gift from Richard years ago, and turned it on. I just wanted a distraction, something to fill the void. The screen lit up, and a social media notification popped up. It was a photo posted by Vanessa less than 20 minutes ago. My finger trembled as I tapped the screen. And there they were, Richard at the wheel, smiling for the camera, Vanessa beside him, making a kissy face and a peace sign. In the back seat, Lawrence and Beatrice were holding up bottles of imported water as if making a toast. They were all beaming, the perfect picture of a happy family on their way to a party. And then I read the caption that went with the photo, a short phrase that pierced what was left of my heart. On our way to celebrate with family. Or love. Happy family. Blessed. The caption was like salt poured on an open wound. Happy family. Those two words danced on the screen, mocking me. What family? The family I had helped build. The family I sacrificed for daily. Wasn't in that picture. I was the invisible gear in that machine, the hidden foundation upon which they built their apparent happiness. I shut off the tablet with a sharp gesture, as if I could erase the image from my mind. But it was too late. The scene was seared onto my eyelids. The smiles, the imported water bottles, the glow of the dashboard in a car I had never even touched. The anger Marlene had awakened in me began to grow, a slow, hot flame that dried my tears and hardened my heart. I wasn't a blessing to them. I was a resource, a good credit score, a bank account from which funds could be drawn without question. Nothing more. The next few days dragged on in a fog of pain and resentment. My nephew's wedding came and went. I received a few calls from relatives asking why I hadn't shown up. I made up some excuse. A sudden migraine, feeling unwell. Lying was never my way, but the truth was too humiliating to share. Each call was a fresh reminder of what I had lost. Meanwhile, Richard's silence was deafening. No phone call, no text message, no visit. It was as if, by leaving me on the sidewalk, he had erased me from his life. His absence was a constant presence in my house, a ghost that sat in the empty chair at the dinner table and watched me eat my solitary meal of toast and butter. I found myself staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring, with a mixture of longing and dread. What would I say if he called? Would I scream? Would I cry? Or would I just accept his apology? As I always did, starved for any crumb of affection. It was Marlene who pulled me out of my stupor. On Wednesday, she showed up at my door with 2 grocery bags. Enough hiding, Helen. You're going to eat a decent meal tonight. She wouldn't take no for an answer. She marched into my kitchen, opened my nearly bare cupboards, and started making a chicken stew, whose aroma filled the house with a sense of normalcy I hadn't felt in days. As she cooked, she talked. Marlene had a gift for mixing trivialities with profound truths. She talked about the new TV series, about the neighbors' cats fighting, and then, casually, she brought it up. You know, Helen, we spend our whole lives watering other people's plants and forget about our own garden. She looked at me over her shoulder. The wooden spoon paused in midair. Your garden is dry, my friend, and it's not from a lack of water. It's from giving all your sunshine to someone who doesn't deserve it. The metaphor was simple, but it hit me with the force of a revelation. I was giving all my sunshine to Richard, and he was using it to light up someone else's world. That night, I could barely sleep. Marlene's words echoed in my mind. My own garden. When was the last time I had thought about myself, my own wants, my own needs? The image of my son smiling in the photo came back to haunt me. But this time, something was different. I started noticing the details. The designer shirt he was wearing, probably bought by Vanessa. The expensive watch on his wrist, a gift from his in-laws, as he had proudly told me. Everything about him was a reflection of other people's desires and expectations. And me, where did I fit into that picture? I was the frame, the structure that held up the canvas, but nobody ever looks at the frame. Driven by a sudden need to understand, I turned on the tablet again. This time, I went straight to Vanessa's profile. I scrolled through her posts, a succession of photos at expensive restaurants, designer stores, and weekend getaways at boutique hotels. In many of them, the SUV appeared, always featured prominently, like a trophy. One photo in particular caught my eye. It was an image of just the car, parked in front of a winery, with the caption, "Living Our Dreams, 1 mile at a time. Thank you, my love, for giving me this." Bile rose in my throat. My love. It was my sacrifice that was giving her that. It was my social security check that was paving the road to her dreams. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In one of the photos, taken in a mall parking lot, the reflection in the car door's window showed Richard handing the keys to a valet. But it wasn't just that. On the rear bumper, where there should have been a small sticker of Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, that I had placed there myself the day the car was delivered, there was nothing. The sticker was gone. It was a small detail, insignificant to anyone else in the world. But to me, it was an act of repudiation, a deliberate and conscious removal of the last trace of my presence on that vehicle. They didn't just want to exclude me physically. They wanted to erase any sign that I was, in any way, part of that story. The car wasn't just a mode of transport. It was a symbol of the new identity they were building, an identity of which I, with my simple faith and my saint stickers, clearly could not be a part. The removed sticker, that small act of desecration, hurt more than the cruel words on the sidewalk. It was a calculated gesture, a silent declaration that my identity, my beliefs, and by extension, my very essence, were an embarrassment to them. I remembered the day I'd put that sticker on. Richard had just picked up the car from the dealership and parked in front of my house. His eyes were shining in a way I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. "Look, Mom, we did it," he'd said. We, plural. In that moment, I felt my sacrifice had been worth it. I went to my kitchen drawer, got the small St. Christopher sticker I'd been saving for years, and with hands trembling with emotion, I pressed it onto the lower corner of the bumper. "To protect you, my son," I said, my voice thick. He hugged me. A quick, slightly awkward hug, but it meant the world to me. Now, the absence of that small blue and white image screamed at me from the tablet screen. They didn't want my protection. They wanted my signature on the loan and nothing more. I decided I needed answers. The silence was consuming me, leaving room for the worst-case scenarios to form in my mind. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to understand. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I dialed his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, it went to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Richard. Please leave a message." His voice, recorded and impersonal, was a cold barrier. I took a deep breath and tried again. Same result. A 3rd try, and the call was disconnected after the 1st ring. Declined. He was deliberately ignoring me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just busy. He was avoiding me. He knew he was in the wrong and didn't have the courage to face the consequences, to look into the eyes of the woman he had humiliated. His cowardice was, somehow, more insulting than the offense itself. Driven by a desperation bordering on madness, I decided to go to his work. Richard was a manager at a sporting goods store in a big mall uptown. I had never been there before. He always said it was too far, or the environment was too hectic. Excuses I now understood were a way of keeping his worlds separate. I took a bus, a long, uncomfortable journey that made me feel even more out of place. The mall was another universe, a palace of marble and glass, with ambient music and air conditioning so cold it made me shiver. I found the store, a large, brightly lit space, with walls covered in colorful sneakers and workout clothes, and there he was, behind the counter, talking to a customer. He was laughing at something the man said, the same charming smile he had used on me to get the loan. For a moment, I was paralyzed, watching him from a distance. He looked so at ease in that environment, so far removed from my small house and my simple life. I gathered my courage and approached. "Richard," I called out, my voice weaker than I intended. He turned, and for a fraction of a second, I saw panic in his eyes. It was a quick flash, soon replaced by a mask of restrained irritation. He excused himself from the customer and came toward me, grabbing my arm with unnecessary force and steering me to a more secluded corner of the store, near the fitting rooms. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he hissed, looking around to make sure no one was listening. The question left me speechless. What was I doing here? I was exercising my right as a mother to speak to my own son. "I called you," I managed to say. "You didn't answer." He let out an impatient sigh. "I'm at work, Mom. I can't be answering the phone every 5 minutes. Did something serious happen?" "Yes, it did," I replied, feeling my anger finally give me strength. "What happened was you abandoned me on the sidewalk last Saturday. What happened was you took the Saint sticker off the car. Is that serious enough for you, Richard?" His expression changed. The irritation gave way to a defensive embarrassment. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he always made when he felt cornered. "Mom, let's not talk about this here. Please." He lowered his voice, almost pleading. "The sticker. Vanessa didn't think it matched the car's style. That's all. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." A mountain out of a molehill. He reduced my pain, my faith, and my love to his wife's aesthetic whim. In that moment, inside that cold, impersonal store, looking at my son's face that seemed like a stranger's, I understood. It wasn't just about the car. It wasn't about the sticker. It was about my place in his life. And the painful truth was that, for him and his new family, my place was nowhere. Before I could respond, a young sales assistant approached. "Richard, Mr. Lawrence is on line 2. He says it's about the weekend trip." Richard turned to her, the relief on his face palpable. "Tell him I'll be right there." He then turned back to me with a rehearsed expression of apology. "Mom, I have to go. We'll talk later, okay?" And he walked away, leaving me alone near the fitting rooms, with the sound of the ambient music drowning out the noise of my heartbreaking, the weekend trip. The sales assistant's words echoed in my ears as I walked out of the store, feeling completely invisible. He couldn't talk to me, his mother, but he had time to take a call from his father-in-law to plan a trip I, evidently, would not be part of. The bus ride back was even more agonizing. The humiliation at the mall, piled on top of the initial rejection, formed a tight knot in my throat. I stared out the window but didn't see the cityscape. I saw only my son's face, his look of panic when he saw me, his relief at getting rid of me. He was building a new life, with new traditions and new priorities, and I was a relic from the past, a reminder of humble origins that he and Vanessa were trying so hard to erase. The Saint sticker, my phone call, my very presence, they were all blemishes on the perfect picture they were trying to paint for the world. And for Lawrence and Beatrice, I got home exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. The house, which had always been my refuge, now just felt empty. I sat in my sewing chair, the familiar worn fabric under my fingers, and let reality wash over me. Richard wouldn't call later. He wouldn't apologize. He saw nothing wrong with what he had done. In his mind, the logic was simple. His mother existed to serve, to provide, to facilitate, pleasure, companionship, fun. That was reserved for the new family, the family that mattered, the one that validated his status. The sharp pain of the first few days began to morph into a deep, resigned sadness. It was grief for a son who, though alive, I felt I had lost. Lost not to death, but to something perhaps worse. Indifference. The days turned into a week. The silence continued. I began to feel like a secondary character in my own life, a spectator to events. It was then, by chance, that I discovered the full extent of my exclusion. I was at the neighborhood bakery, waiting in line, when I overheard two neighbors talking in low voices. "Did you see Helen's son's new car? That thing's fancy," said one. "Tell me about it," replied the other. My daughter-in-law is friends with Vanessa's cousin. Said they're spending the weekend at a resort in the Berkshires. With her parents, of course. Vanessa posted all about it. Said Richard is the son-in-law of the year. That he does everything for them. The words hit me with the force of a slap. The Berkshires. A resort. Son-in-law of the year. So that's what my money was for. To fund lavish trips for the in-laws who looked down on him. To buy their approval with my sacrifice. Who hadn't taken a vacation in over a decade, was paying for Lawrence and Beatrice to enjoy a weekend of leisure. The irony was so cruel, so absurd, that for a moment, instead of crying, I felt a hysterical urge to laugh. I walked home with the loaf of bread under my arm, but with no appetite. The information from the bakery shed a new light on everything. It wasn't just negligence, it was a plan. Vanessa, with her ambition and desire for status, was using my son and my money as a tool to establish herself socially and to please her parents. And Richard, in his insecurity and eagerness to be accepted into that new world, was letting her. He was a willing participant in my exploitation. The memory of a specific moment from a few months back came to me with painful clarity. It was a flashback that recontextualized everything. I was at their house for lunch, and Vanessa was going on and on about a couple they knew who had traveled to Europe. Her husband is such a good provider, you know, she'd said, glancing sideways at Richard. He understands that your family is your foundation. Her parents went with them, of course. He insisted on paying for everything. That's how a real man acts. At the time, I dismissed it as idle chatter. Now, I saw the clear manipulation in her words. She was planting seeds in Richard's mind, setting a standard of behavior that he, desperate to please her, felt compelled to follow. And who would foot the bill for that charade? Me, the foolish, loyal mother, with my hard-earned retirement savings. The weekend arrived, and with it, the certainty that they were far away, breathing in the fresh mountain air while I breathed the dust in my living room. The loneliness was crushing. I turned on the television but couldn't focus. I opened a book, but the words blurred together. The silence of the house was filled only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second a reminder of the time passing, the time I was losing, the life I wasn't living. Compelled by a masochism I didn't understand, I picked up the tablet one more time, and there it was, just as I knew it would be. A new photo from Vanessa, she and Richard, smiling, with a backdrop of green mountains. He had his arm around her waist. The caption, "Perfect weekend with my love and my parents, making dreams come true." And then, amidst the comments from friends praising the couple, one in particular stood out. It was from Lawrence, the father-in-law. Proud of our new son, a man who knows how to take care of family. That was the last straw. Our new son. They had adopted him, and in the process, they had made me an orphan of my own child. Our new son. The phrase repeated in my head like a scratched record, each repetition chipping away a piece of my identity. I had carried him for 9 months, felt his first kicks, spent sleepless nights by his bed when he had a fever, sewed late into the night to pay for his education. I was his mother, but to Lawrence, a man who had known him for little more than a year, Richard was a new son, a title granted not by blood or love, but by his ability to provide luxuries. The transaction was clear. In exchange for social acceptance, my son had traded his mother for a pair of well-off in-laws, and the most painful part was that the price of that trade was coming directly out of my pocket. The anger I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't a hot, explosive rage, but an ice spreading through my veins, freezing the sadness and turning it into a cold, hard resolve. On Monday, when they returned from their trip, I expected some contact, a perfunctory call, perhaps But the silence persisted. It was clear that, in their minds, life was proceeding as normal. The mother paid the bills, and they enjoyed the benefits. That was the new order of things. It was in this state of mind that I opened my mailbox that afternoon. Amid the utility bills, one envelope stood out. It was from the bank. My heart sped up. Maybe it was a notice, a promotion. But when I opened it, the contents made my stomach churn. It was the detailed statement for the vehicle financing. Normally, I just looked at the payment amount and filed the paper away. But this time, something compelled me to read the fine print. And it was there, in a section I had never paid attention to before, that I found it, a clause about the car insurance. Slowly, I processed the words. The mandatory liability insurance had been purchased, as required by the bank. But the comprehensive policy, the one covering theft, accidents, and collision, the one that cost a considerable amount, was not in my name. In fact, my name didn't even appear as a secondary insured party. The sole beneficiary, the only name listed on the policy, was Richard's. I remembered a conversation we'd had months ago when we signed the papers. "Let me handle the insurance part, Mom. It's easier to have everything in my name, since I'll be the one driving," he had said, in his practical, convincing way. And I, in my blind trust, had agreed without a second thought. Now, I saw the truth. It wasn't about convenience. It was about ownership. If anything happened to the car, a crash, a theft, the insurance payout would go entirely to him. I, the person legally responsible for the loan, the person whose credit would be ruined in case of default, wouldn't be entitled to a single cent. I was paying for an asset that, in every practical and legal sense, belonged solely to him. I was the financier, not the owner, the guarantor of a dream that wasn't mine, and in which I had no share. This discovery was the push I needed. The humiliation, the exclusion, the financial exploitation. It all crystallized into a single point. They didn't just use me. They had legally insulated themselves to ensure that, even in the worst-case scenario, I would lose, and they would win. The naivete with which I had entered into this agreement filled me with shame. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let my motherly love turn me into such a fool? That night, instead of sitting in my armchair and mourning, I did something different. I went to the closet in the small, dusty guest room and dug out an old metal box. Inside were all the important documents of my life: my birth certificate, my sewing course diplomas, the paid-off deed to my house. And at the bottom of the box, I found what I was looking for: the original contract for the car loan. I spent hours hunched over that document at the kitchen table, a cup of cold tea beside me. The complex clauses, which once seemed intimidating, were now a puzzle I was determined to solve. I read and reread every paragraph, every asterisk, every footnote. My legal knowledge was nil, but I had something more powerful: the motivation of a woman pushed to her limit. And then I found it, a small clause, almost hidden in the middle of banking jargon, about the responsibilities of the primary debtor. It clearly stated that the primary debtor, whose name was at the top of the contract, my name, had the right to request the status of the financed asset at any time, and more importantly, any structural change to the contract, including a transfer of title or the use of the asset as collateral for other financial operations, required my express signature. A thought, bold and terrifying, began to form in my mind. I still had some power. I was not just a passive victim. I was the key to that contract. The question was, would I have the courage to use that key to lock the door I myself had opened? Discovering that clause was like finding a single candle in a dark room. It didn't illuminate everything, but it showed me there was a path, a way out that wasn't passive resignation. The small flame of power I felt that night kept me warm during the days that followed. I still didn't know exactly what to do, but I knew I couldn't go on as I was. The image of myself, sitting at the kitchen table deciphering that contract, marked a fundamental shift within me. The Helen who only cried and lamented was giving way to a Helen who questioned, investigated, and armed herself with information. The seamstress, accustomed to following patterns and pre-drawn lines, was beginning to think about creating her own design, one that didn't involve being walked all over. I continued my routine, went to the bakery, talked with Marlene, watered my ferns. But inside, a quiet revolution was underway. The turning point, the event that transformed my budding thought into concrete action, came in an unexpected way, through a simple credit card bill. It arrived on Friday, a week after their trip to the Berkshires. I opened it distractedly, expecting to find only my usual grocery and pharmacy expenses. But one charge jumped out at me, a single, large purchase that I didn't immediately recognize. The name of the establishment was the Berkshire Gourmet. The date was from the previous Friday. It took my brain a few seconds to connect the dots. The Berkshires, the in-laws, trip, the son-in-law of the year. On impulse, I picked up the phone and called the credit card company. Richard had been an authorized user on my card since college, a habit we'd never corrected. After confirming my details, the agent gave me the specifics of the purchase: imported wines, fine cheeses, artisanal chocolates, a luxury gift basket, bought to impress Lawrence and Beatrice, paid for with my credit card. I hung up the phone and felt the floor drop out from under me. It wasn't just the car loan, it was everything. He was using my credit, my good name, to finance every detail of this charade. The wine basket was the final proof that I wasn't a mother, but a limitless ATM, a resource to be exploited to the last drop. The anger I felt was so pure, so intense, that it left me trembling. I looked at the bill on the table. I looked at the loan payment book on the fridge. And then I looked at the phone. The doubt, the fear of losing my son forever, all of it dissipated, replaced by a sharp, cutting clarity. Lose what? I had already lost him. What I had was a parasitic relationship, an illusion of affection maintained at the cost of my dignity and financial security. With a steady hand, I dialed Richard's number. This time, he answered on the second ring. "Mom, did something happen?" he asked, a note of weariness in his voice, as if my call were an unwelcome interruption. "Yes, Richard. Something happened," I said, and my voice came out calm, cold, devoid of any emotion. "My credit card bill happened. A gourmet shop in the Berkshires happened. Do you want to explain that to me?" There was a silence on the other end of the line, a guilty silence. "Oh, that," he finally said, trying to sound casual. "Mom, I was going to tell you. I'll pay you back next month. It was just an unexpected expense." "No, Richard, it wasn't an unexpected expense." I cut him off, and the strength in my own voice surprised me. "It was a choice. You chose to use my money to buy the admiration of other people, while I choose which bills to pay late so I can afford the car you use to drive them around. Our choices are no longer compatible." "Mom, you're overreacting," he started, but I didn't let him continue. "No, I'm just starting to see things as they are, and because of that, Richard, I'm calling to let you know. As of today, you have two options. Option 1, you go to the bank tomorrow, transfer the car loan entirely into your name, and remove me from the contract. Option 2, I call the bank, and I stop the automatic payments from my account. The car is in my name. The debt is mine, and I'm choosing not to pay for it anymore." The silence on the other end was so profound I could hear his breathing. He was in shock, unable to process that the bottomless well had run dry. "Mom, you can't do that," he stammered, and for the first time, I heard panic in his voice. "That'll ruin my credit. What will Vanessa and her parents think? And there it was. His concern wasn't for me, or for our relationship. It was for his image, for his facade. In that instant, all the pain transformed into certainty. I was doing the right thing. "I don't know what they'll think, son," I replied, with a deadly calm. "But you have 24 hours to decide. The choice is yours." And then, for the first time in my life, I hung up the phone on him. Hanging up the phone was like closing a door I had kept open my entire life, always hoping he would walk through it. The final click of the receiver ending the call echoed in the silence of my living room, and I felt, paradoxically, terrified and incredibly free. The hand that held the phone was still shaking, but it was a tremor of adrenaline, not weakness. I had drawn a line in the sand. I had set a boundary, something I should have done years ago. The following night was long and sleepless. Every noise on the street made me jump. I expected him to show up at my door at any moment, either furious or pleading. But the night passed and morning came, and there was no sign of Richard. His silence was a weapon, a tactic he had always used. He was waiting for me to give in, for remorse to consume me, and for me to call back and retract my ultimatum. But the Helen who waited anxiously for her son's forgiveness no longer existed. I spent the day in a state of high alert, my stomach in knots. Every time the phone rang, my heart leaped. It was Marlene, asking if I needed anything. It was an unknown number, offering a new phone plan, but it wasn't him. The 24-hour deadline was running out, and the lack of a response was, in itself, a response. He was testing me, believing I wouldn't have the guts to go through with it. He was wrong. The next morning, exactly 25 hours after my call, I took the bank statement and the loan contract and marched to the bank branch. I sat across from the manager, a young man with a tired look in his eyes, and explained the situation with a clarity that surprised me. "I am the primary debtor on this loan," I said, pointing to the contract, "and I can no longer financially afford the payments. I want to cancel the automatic debit from my account, effective immediately." The manager looked at me with a mixture of pity and professionalism. He explained the consequences, the late fees, the interest, the negative mark on my credit report, and eventually, the repossession of the vehicle. I listened to it all in silence, nodding. "I understand," I replied, "but my decision is final." He sighed, printed out a form, and handed me the pen. As my signature scratched across the paper, I felt an immense weight lift from my shoulders. It was an act of financial self-destruction, perhaps, but it was also an act of emotional self-preservation. I was choosing my peace of mind over my good credit score. As I left the bank, the sun seemed brighter. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of that future payment looming over me. Freedom, however costly, was invigorating. 2 days passed. The quiet was just the calm before the storm. And I knew it. The explosion came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard the front door burst open. Richard stormed in like a hurricane, his face red with fury. Vanessa was right behind him, her arms crossed and a look of contempt on her face. "Have you lost your mind?" he yelled, his voice echoing through the small house. "I went to get gas, and the card was declined. The gas card. I called the bank and they told me the loan has a missed payment. What the hell did you do?" I dried my hands slowly on a dish towel and turned to face him. The calm I felt was an island in his ocean of rage. "I did exactly what I said I would do. Richard, I gave you a choice." "That wasn't a choice. It was a trap," he retorted, gesturing wildly. "How am I supposed to pay this? How am I supposed to transfer the loan into my name when I don't have the required income? You know I won't pass a credit check." "I know," I replied, my voice even, just like I shouldn't have passed. But I did, because my credit history was flawless, a history built on years of hard work and sacrifice. It was Vanessa who intervened, her voice dripping with venom. "You're doing this to hurt us. It's pure selfishness. You can't stand to see your son happy, building a better life." The accusation was so absurd, so far from the truth, that I almost laughed. "Happy?" I asked, looking directly at Richard. "Were you happy when you left me on the sidewalk to drive your in-laws around? Were you happy when you used my credit card without permission? If this is your happiness, Richard, then I don't want to be a part of it. And I certainly don't want to finance it anymore." The mention of his in-laws made Richard flinch, his momentary embarrassment silencing him. He knew I had hit a nerve, but Vanessa was unfazed. "My parents have nothing to do with this," she said, haughtily. "They just appreciate a son-in-law who knows how to treat a family." "And how does one treat a family, Vanessa?" I asked, taking a step forward. "Is it by lying? By exploiting one's own mother? By caring more about appearances than about people? If that's the case, then you two really do deserve each other." The open confrontation, the words that had never been spoken, hung in the air, charged with years of contained resentment. The house, once a home of unconditional love, had become a battlefield, and I, for the first time, was not willing to retreat. The fight that followed was ugly, filled with accusations and old wounds. But amid the shouting and harsh words, one thing became clear. Their concern was not for me or our relationship. It was for the loss of the car, the status symbol they cherished so much. The car was more important than the mother. And that realization, though painful, solidified my decision. I had cut the financial umbilical cord, and they were feeling the withdrawal. The argument ended with a slammed door. They left as abruptly as they had entered, leaving behind a trail of toxic energy and words that could not be unsaid. I stood alone in the middle of the living room, my heart pounding, not from fear, but from a strange exhilaration. I had spoken the truth. I had defended my territory, my dignity. The silence that followed their departure was profound, but it wasn't the empty silence of loneliness. It was the silence of recovery, of a space being cleansed after a storm. That night, for the first time in a long time, I slept a deep and dreamless sleep. I woke the next morning feeling a lightness that wasn't just the absence of worry about the next payment, but the absence of the weight of a lopsided relationship. I knew the story wouldn't end there. The bank notification was just the first step. The repossession process would take time. In the meantime, I lived in a kind of limbo. Part of me still held a flicker of hope that Richard would come to his senses, that the prospect of losing the car would make him see the magnitude of his mistake. But the other part, the part that was growing and strengthening every day, knew that the change, if it came, would have to be much deeper than a simple apology to get the loan reinstated. It would have to be a change of heart, a reevaluation of his values, and I wasn't sure he was capable of that. Marlene became my rock during that period. She'd stop by every day, sometimes with a slice of cake, other times just to sit with me on the porch. She didn't offer unsolicited advice or judge my decisions. She just listened. "You're taller, Helen," she told me one day, as we watched the pigeons in the square. I laughed. "What do you mean, taller?" "I don't know," she answered thoughtfully. "Your posture is different. You seem more upright, like you've taken a weight off your back." Her words touched me deeply, because it was exactly how I felt. The burden of needing approval, which had kept me hunched over for so long, was finally dissipating. I was learning to stand up on my own, without needing my son's validation. The news of my rebellion spread through the family like wildfire. I got a call from my sister, Lucy, who lived in another state. Her tone was reproachful. "Helen, what are you doing?" The boy called me, desperate. "Said you freaked out over something silly. He's your only son. For God's sake. Mothers forgive. Mothers sacrifice." Her words, spoken with the best of intentions, stung. "Lucy, you don't know the half of it," I replied, weary. "Sacrifice is one thing. Being a doormat is another, and I'm done being walked on." The conversation ended on a cold note. I realized that, for many, the image of the selfless mother was so ingrained that any deviation from that role was seen as selfishness, as a moral failing. I was challenging not only Richard, but an entire culture that expects mothers to love unconditionally, even when that love is not returned with a minimum of respect. The most painful proof of this came the following Sunday. It was a great-aunt's birthday, and the family was gathering for lunch. I hesitated to go, but decided I wouldn't hide. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. People greeted me but averted their eyes. Richard and Vanessa were there, in a corner, surrounded by cousins who seemed to be offering support. They had told their version of the story, that of the ungrateful, unstable mother who, in a fit of jealousy, decided to ruin her son's life. No one came to talk to me. No one asked for my side. I was being judged and condemned in silence. I sat at a table by myself, ate a piece of cake, and watched. I saw Richard laughing at a joke a cousin told. Saw Vanessa showing photos on her phone to a cousin. They were playing the role of victims masterfully, and I, the real victim of the story, was now the villain. The pain of that isolation was intense. It was easier for the family to believe their narrative than to confront the uncomfortable truth that a son could be so cruel to his own mother. Leaving that party felt like escaping a room with no air. As I walked to the bus stop, a certainty formed within me. I might have lost the support of my family, but I would not lose respect for myself. That lunch cemented my resolve. They could have public opinion, but I had my truth, and for the first time, that was enough. The isolation at the family party was a harsh blow, but it served an unexpected purpose. It freed me from the need for external approval. If even my own family, who had known me my whole life, could judge me so quickly based on a one-sided, distorted version of the facts, then their opinion could no longer be my compass. My compass, from that moment on, would be my own conscience, my own inner truth. I returned home that afternoon and, instead of surrendering to sadness, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my old sewing cabinet, dusted off my Singer machine, oiled its gears, and threaded a new line of thread through the needle. The familiar hum of the motor as I pressed the pedal was like the voice of an old friend welcoming me back. I took a scrap of fabric and began to sew, aimlessly, just feeling the cloth slide under my fingers, the rhythm of the needle rising and falling. Sewing had always been my job, my livelihood. But in that moment, it became my therapy, an act of reconnecting with myself. The following days were filled with the sound of the sewing machine. I rummaged through my closet for old clothes, dresses that no longer fit, blouses that were out of style. I began to transform them, to create new pieces from the old. A dress became a skirt and a top. An old men's shirt gained delicate embroidery and became a bohemian tunic. I wasn't just mending fabrics. I was mending my soul, stitch by stitch. Each piece I created was an act of affirmation, a reminder that I was capable of creating beauty and value from things others had discarded. It was a powerful metaphor for what I was trying to do with my own life. About a week after the confrontation in my house, I received a certified letter. It was an official notice from the bank, informing me of the overdue payment and setting a final deadline to clear the debt before legal proceedings for repossession would begin. The document, with its legal terms and official stamps, would have terrified me weeks ago. Now, I read it with a detached calm. It was just paper, a consequence of my choices, and I was ready to face it. What surprised me, however, was what happened the next day. The doorbell rang. It was a man in a suit, holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a process server. My heart froze for an instant. Was it the repossession? So soon? But he wasn't there for that. He handed me an envelope and asked me to sign for it. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a summons. Richard had filed a lawsuit against me. I read the document, incredulous. He claimed we had a verbal agreement in which I had committed to paying the entire loan as a gift to him. He claimed my refusal to pay was a breach of contract and accused me of unlawful conversion, since the car was in my name but was, according to him, in his possession and for his exclusive use by right. And, the lowest blow of all, he was requesting a protective order, claiming that I was psychologically harassing him with my demands, which was damaging his mental health and his marital relationship. I had to sit down. The air was knocked out of me. He wasn't just trying to force me to pay. He was trying to legally turn me into a criminal, an abusive mother. The cruelty of the act was so abysmal, so unimaginable, that my brain refused to accept it. Vanessa, with her ambition and lack of scruples, was surely behind this. It was a scorched earth tactic. If they couldn't have the car, they would destroy my reputation and my peace in the process. I sat in my armchair for hours, the summons in my lap, feeling a cold that didn't come from the open window. That piece of paper was the definitive proof that the son I loved no longer existed. In his place was a stranger capable of using the justice system to manipulate and intimidate his own mother. The pain was immense, but underneath it, the flame of resolve that had been kindled in me did not go out. On the contrary, it burned even brighter. If it was a war they wanted, it was a war they would get. But I wouldn't fight with their weapons. Lies, manipulation, cruelty. I would fight with the only weapon I had, the truth. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the truth, when you are on its side, is the most powerful weapon of all. I picked up the phone. I didn't call Richard or my sister. I called the number of a family law attorney that Marlene had given me weeks earlier, just in case. "Mr. Miller, my name is Helen," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly firm. "I need your help." The decision to seek legal help was like turning on a light in a dark, musty basement. Suddenly, the shapeless shadows of fear and uncertainty began to take on definite forms, becoming problems that could be analyzed and confronted. Mr. Miller's office was downtown, in an old building with a noisy elevator that seemed to sigh on every floor. Mr. Miller himself was a man with graying hair and kind eyes, who listened to me with a patience that disarmed me. I poured the whole story out on his mahogany desk, between stacks of case files, the loan, the humiliation on the sidewalk, the social media posts, the credit card, the summons. I handed him every document I had gathered, the contract, the bank statements, the bank notice, and my son's absurd lawsuit. He read everything in silence, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long time. "Mrs. Miller," he began, his voice calm, "you have been the victim of a cruel form of abuse, one that is, unfortunately, more common than people think. Financial and emotional abuse. They took advantage of your good faith and your love as a mother. To hear that from an authority, from a stranger who saw the situation with professional clarity, was incredibly validating. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I was a victim." Mr. Miller then began to dismantle Richard's lawsuit, point by point. The verbal agreement he alleges is legally irrelevant in the face of a signed contract where you are listed as the sole primary debtor. The unlawful conversion charge is ridiculous, as the asset is legally in your name. And the protective order for psychological harassment is a desperate and offensive attempt to reverse the roles of victim and aggressor. We will contest every one of these claims, and we'll do more. He leaned forward, and his kind eyes now had a steely glint. We are going to file a countersuit. We will sue him for emotional distress, for the humiliation and pain you've endured. And we will demand reimbursement for all the funds you have unduly paid, including the car payments, the credit card charges, and any other expenses we can prove. We will use your daughter-in-law's social media posts as evidence, the photos of the trips, the captions about making dreams come true. All of this demonstrates a lifestyle incompatible with their declared income, supported at your expense. I was stunned. I had never thought of fighting back, of demanding restitution. My only intention had been to defend myself and get out from under the debt. The idea of turning the tables, of putting them on the stand, was frightening and, at the same time, empowering. "Do you have the strength to see this through, Helen?" he asked, looking at me seriously. "Because they will fight dirty. They will try to demoralize you. They will use your family relationship against you in court." I looked down at my hands, the gnarled fingers that had worked for 40 years. I thought of the sidewalk, the removed sticker, the family lunch. "Yes, Mr. Miller," I replied, lifting my chin. "I do. I left Mr. Miller's office feeling like a different woman. Fear had been replaced by a cold determination. He instructed me to have no further contact with Richard or Vanessa, and to save any communication they tried to make. The battle would now be fought in the proper arena, under the rule of law, and no longer on the minefield of family emotions. In the weeks that followed, the situation escalated, just as the lawyer had predicted. I received text messages from Richard, alternating between pleas and threats. "Mom, for the love of God, drop the lawsuit. You're going to destroy my life. If you don't stop this, I will never speak to you again. You'll die alone." I forwarded every message to Mr. Miller without replying. Relatives started calling again, now prodded by Richard, accusing me of being a heartless mother, of airing our dirty laundry in public. "Helen, this is shameful. Settling things in court. Who ever heard of such a thing?" my sister's shocked voice said over the phone. I just replied calmly, "He started it. Lucy, I'm just defending myself." Meanwhile, the final notice from the bank arrived. The deadline for voluntary surrender of the vehicle had passed. The repossession order could be executed at any moment. I didn't know where the car was, and I didn't care. My fight was now a different one. It was a fight for my dignity, for my name, for the truth. In the midst of it all, I kept sewing. My small collection of upcycled clothing was growing. Marlene, seeing the pieces, had an idea. "Helen, why don't you sell these? There's a craft fair in the town square at the end of the month. I'll help you set up a booth." The idea seemed absurd at first. Who would buy my creations? But Marlene insisted, and with nothing to lose, I agreed. I threw myself into the work, and with every stitch, every hem, I felt I was sewing not just fabric, but a new future for myself, a future that depended on no one but my own creativity and my own strength. The day of the mediation hearing arrived, gray and damp, a perfect reflection of my mood. Despite all my resolve, the prospect of facing Richard in a courtroom filled me with a cold anxiety. Mr. Miller met me at the courthouse entrance, his firm handshake conveying a calm I did not possess. "Remember, Helen," he said in a low voice as we walked down the polished marble hallways. "Today, you are not his mother. You are the aggrieved party. Stay calm, and let me do the talking." We entered the small hearing room, and there they were. Richard sat next to his lawyer, an arrogant-looking man in an expensive suit. My son looked thinner, with dark circles under his eyes. He wouldn't look at me. Vanessa sat in the row behind them like a spectator at a play, her face a mask of contained hostility. The air in the room was so heavy it felt hard to breathe. The judge, a middle-aged man with an impassive expression, began the session. Richard's lawyer started to speak, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He painted a picture of a devoted son and an elderly, emotionally unstable mother who, influenced by loneliness and jealousy, had decided to take revenge on her son for his marital happiness. He described the car loan as a gift, an act of maternal generosity, and my refusal to pay as a shocking and inexplicable betrayal. Every word was a distortion, a stab. I felt my blood boil, but I held on to Mr. Miller's word and remained silent, my hands clenched in my lap. When it was my lawyer's turn, he stood up slowly. He didn't use inflammatory adjectives or raise his voice. He simply presented the facts, one by one, with relentless logic. He presented the loan agreement, highlighting my sole responsibility. He presented my credit card statements, showing the luxury purchases made by Richard. He presented the insurance policy, proving I had been excluded from any rights to the asset I was paying for. And then, he did something I didn't expect. He picked up a folder and took out several sheets of glossy, color-printed paper. Your Honor, what we have here are several social media posts from the plaintiff's wife, Mr. Miller said, as he handed a copy to the judge and another to Richard's lawyer, while my client, a retiree on a fixed income, was canceling her supplemental health insurance to make these payments. The couple was enjoying expensive trips, dinners at luxury restaurants, and consumer goods inconsistent with the income the plaintiff claims to have. All of it thoroughly documented and publicly celebrated. I could see Richard's face turn pale as his lawyer flipped through the printouts. The photo in the Berkshires, the wines, the Raj happy family caption. It was all there, under the cold light of the court. Vanessa's expression, in the back row, was one of pure shock, as if her private diary had been read aloud. Mr. Miller continued, his firm voice filling the stunned silence. This is not a case of an unstable mother, Your Honor. This is a documented case of financial exploitation, of the abuse of an elderly person's trust. The lawsuit filed by the plaintiff is not just baseless. It is a cruel attempt to intimidate the true victim of this story. The judge looked at the printouts, then at Richard, and then at me. His face, once impassive, now held a glimmer of understanding, of disgust. He addressed Richard directly. Mr. Miller, are you aware of these posts? My son stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. That doesn't prove anything, he managed to say. It proves that you and your wife were flaunting a lifestyle financed by your mother's sacrifice, while simultaneously excluding her from your life. And when she refused to continue being your provider, you tried to destroy her legally, the judge said, his tone now sharp as glass. He then turned to Richard's lawyer. Counselor, I strongly advise you to have a word with your client. Given what has been presented, the claim of psychological harassment and the request for a protective order are, frankly, an insult to the intelligence of this court. The silence that followed was the most tense moment of my life. The world seemed to stop. Richard looked at me, and for the first time that day, our eyes met. In his gaze, I didn't see anger. I saw panic. I saw the sudden, terrifying realization that his house of cards, built on my savings and his own arrogance, was about to collapse. In that instant, I knew I had won. The truth had won. The judge called for a 15-minute recess for the parties to confer. We left the hearing room and stood on opposite sides of the hallway. I stood next to Mr. Miller, who handed me a cup of water with steady hands. On the other side, I witnessed a scene I will never forget. Richard and his lawyer were arguing in tense, low voices. Vanessa approached them, her face contorted with fury. Her words, though whispered, were sharp enough to cut through the stuffy corridor air. You told me you had this under control. You told me she would back down. Look at the shame you've brought on us. My parents are going to hear about this. She wasn't worried about him, the lawsuit, or their family relationship. She was worried about her image, about the public humiliation. In that moment, I saw the poisonous dynamic of their relationship with crystal clarity. Richard was not the master of the situation. He was a pawn in Vanessa's game of ambition. Richard's lawyer approached us, his arrogance replaced by a forced, conciliatory demeanor. "Mr. Miller, Helen, my client is willing to withdraw all charges. He understands there has been a misunderstanding." Mr. Miller crossed his arms. "A misunderstanding that cost my client her peace of mind, her sleep, and her dignity. Withdrawing the charges is not enough." The negotiation that followed was swift. Mr. Miller was relentless. To prevent our countersuit for emotional distress from moving forward, they had to agree to all our terms. The final deal was sealed right there in the courthouse hallway. Richard would withdraw his lawsuit and all accusations against me. He would take responsibility for contacting the bank and negotiating the loan debt, removing my name from any future obligation. And, most importantly, he would pay me a symbolic settlement, covering the credit card purchases and a small portion of the payments I had made. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was an acknowledgement of my loss, an admission of his guilt. We returned to the room, and the agreement was approved by the judge. At the end, as we were all standing, Richard turned to me. He looked like a defeated man, aged 10 years in a few hours. "Mom, I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. The words I had longed to hear for months, but hearing them there, in that sterile environment, after such a dirty fight, they sounded empty, hollow. They were the words of a cornered man, not a repentant son. I just nodded, a minimal gesture, and turned to leave. There was nothing left to say. As I left the courthouse, the gray sky had broken, and a timid ray of sunlight pierced the clouds. It felt like a sign. The storm in my life was also passing. In the days that followed, news of the outcome spread. The first consequence was the most predictable: the car. Without my co-signature or my money, Richard couldn't renegotiate the debt. 2 weeks after the hearing, I heard from Marlene, who heard from a neighbor, that the gleaming black SUV had been towed from the front of his house in broad daylight. The mental image of that scene didn't bring me joy or a sense of revenge. It only brought a deep melancholy for what it all represented, a status symbol bought with lies and sacrifice that was, in the end, nothing but an empty shell. The loss of the car was the catalyst for the collapse of Richard's marriage. Without the vehicle to impress his in-laws and without access to my unlimited fund, the son-in-law of the year lost his shine. Vanessa, whose affection was clearly transactional, didn't take long to show her true colors. Less than a month later, Richard showed up at my door. He was thin, haggard, carrying a small suitcase. Vanessa had kicked him out. She said she didn't marry a failure, he told me, his voice breaking as he sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I had spent so many sleepless nights because of him. He wept, a racking, convulsive cry of genuine remorse. He told me how Vanessa had manipulated him, how she pressured him to keep up appearances, how she mocked his origins and me. He admitted everything: the lying, the exploitation, the cowardice. I listened in silence, my heart heavy with an old sorrow. There was no anger left, only a weary compassion for this man who was my son, but had lost his way. He didn't ask to stay with me, and I didn't offer. That time had passed, but I did what a mother does. I made him a plate of food, the same chicken stew Marlene had made for me on my worst days. As he ate in silence, I knew this was the beginning of a path to rebuilding. Not our old relationship, but perhaps, with a great deal of time and effort, something new, something based not on sacrifice and dependency, but on respect and truth. That silent dinner in my kitchen wasn't a magic wand that fixed everything, but it was the first stone laid for a new foundation. Richard didn't stay with me. He rented a small room in a boarding house in the neighborhood and found a job as a stalker at a supermarket. Honest work that required no fancy car or appearances. He began to pay me back, in small monthly installments, the settlement amount we had agreed upon in court. It wasn't the money that mattered, but the act, the commitment to repairing the damage he had caused. In the months that followed, our relationship slowly changed. Our meetings were tentative, hesitant. He would show up on Sundays, no longer to ask for things, but to offer. He'd bring fresh bread from the bakery, fix the dripping faucet, help me take out the trash. They were small gestures, but they were laden with immense meaning. They were acts of service from a son who was relearning how to care. We talked, not about the past. That was a minefield we both avoided, but about the present. He spoke of his job, his co-workers, the difficulties of starting over. And I spoke of my sewing, the craft fair, which had started as one of Marlene's ideas, had become a central part of my new life. My booth, with its colorful and unique clothes made from forgotten garments, started to become popular. People were charmed by the stories behind each transformation. Women my age, especially, connected with the idea of giving new purpose to what seemed old, of finding beauty in what had been discarded. The sewing that had once funded Richard's dreams was now funding mine. With the money from my sales, I replaced my kitchen floor, bought a better health insurance plan, and for the first time in years, started a small savings account just for me. About 6 months after the hearing, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, Richard showed up with a small envelope in his hands. "This is for you," he said, his voice a little shaky. Inside was a receipt. He had paid off the final installment of the legal settlement. "I know this doesn't erase anything I did, Mom," he said, looking me in the eye, and this time, there was no excuse or self-pity in his gaze, only an honest sorrow. "But I want you to know that I think about it every day, and every day, I try to be a better man than I was. At that moment, I knew that forgiveness, true forgiveness, wasn't an act of forgetting, but of acceptance. Acceptance that people can make terrible mistakes, but they can also learn. They can change." I reached out and squeezed his hand. "I know, son, I know." Today, 3 weeks after that moment, I sit on my porch, watching the street life go by. Life is not a fairy tale. My relationship with Richard will never be the same. Trust, once broken, is like a glued porcelain vase. The cracks will always be there, visible, but we have learned to live with them, to build something new around the imperfections. He continues on his path, fighting to rebuild his life with dignity, and I continue on mine, flourishing in my newfound independence. The imported SUV is just a distant memory, an expensive lesson about the true value of things. I've discovered that luxury isn't in the roar of an engine, but in the hum of my sewing machine. Happiness isn't being driven around, but having the strength to walk on your own 2 feet. And love, true love, doesn't demand that we erase ourselves. It encourages us to be the fullest, most authentic versions of ourselves. The Uber my son suggested I take on that terrible morning ended up taking me to the most important destination of all, back to myself. And for that journey, as painful as it was, I am, finally, grateful.